as your good luck would strike once again in 2020, you get a flesh-eating bacteria and you end up having 2 strokes and more seizures.
2020 hit and COVID became a big thing. I was overseas when the whole COVID started. And at first, we didn't think it would really affect us, as I think most people in the world thought. But it got to the point where no one was allowed to leave base, minimal contact. It eventually got to the point where, like, you couldn't go to the gym, but there were certain times, like, it kind of became like prison, where there was like an outdoor gym space, but only so many people could go. And so you were allowed out of your room at certain times to go use that facility, and then you had to be back in your room. And there were people that would bring food to your room so that you didn't have cross-contamination, and they did everything to try to minimize it. So at that time, it turned into we only need very minimal personnel to stay. And I had already been in country for like 2 months. So, and there were some guys that just got there like the week before that call was made, and I made the decision, hey, let them stay and make some money. I made some money to live off of for the next couple months, which we didn't know that it was going to turn into the pandemic that it became. So I opted to come home, let other guys stay. And I got home, and pretty quickly things started shutting down around the U.S. I was living back in Florida at this point. So they shut down like every activity, but outdoor activities were still allowed. So I went kayaking just to get out of the house, do something physical, enjoy nature. But I had also just recently gotten some tattoo work done on my leg. So probably not the smartest idea, but I always thought that was like a recommended thing for the healing process of the tattoo. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before, and so, didn't expect it to happen now.
What part of Florida?
Up in the Panhandle, just north of Panama City.
Yeah.
So still pretty swampy. It was a natural springs, but, it's Florida, so there's all kinds of like meth needles and shit floating around in the water. So I went kayaking, had a good time. And then 3 or 4 days later, I woke up in the middle of the night and my left knee right over my kneecap just felt real stiff. Like that patella tendon was just real tight. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't debilitating. It was like I woke up and maybe took some Tylenol and like walked around the house and stretched, trying to loosen it up. And got back in bed, fell back to sleep for like 2 hours, woke up, and it was significantly worse at that point. So then I started thinking maybe, and it was red, it was inflamed, it was hot to the touch. I was like, maybe something bit me while I was sleeping, spider, something. So I went to an urgent care just to get checked out to be safe. And they looked at me, and at this point, I was still pretty fit. I was 6'3" and about 250 pounds. So they looked at me and they said, they did some blood work, but everything came back normal. And they said, I think this is just an overuse injury. You either sprained your patella or you got bursitis in your knee, were what they thought it was. So they gave me steroids to treat it.
And get jacked.
Yeah, not those steroids. But yeah, they gave me steroids to treat it and sent me on my way, but told me if it continues to get worse, follow up with this orthopedic surgeon. That was on a Sunday. And Tuesday comes around, and it's now starting to look like I'm growing a second knee on top of my actual knee. So I was like, I think this qualifies to call that orthopedic doc and get a second opinion. So I called them, and they told me, yeah, we can get you in 2 weeks. And I was like, I don't think this is going to wait. Like, I could barely put weight on the leg. I couldn't bend it at all.
You have pictures and shit of that, I'm assuming.
Yeah. I have pictures that the doctors took during the surgeries, too. Wow.
Any pictures, video of anything that you've talked about, we'd love to put it into the YouTube.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I called them. They said, we can get you in 2 weeks. I was like, this isn't going to wait 2 weeks. They asked if I could email some pictures of it over to them. So I sent them some pictures and they said, yeah, we need you to come in today. So as soon as you can get up here, we'll get him to see you in between patients. So I showed up. He comes in. At that time, all I could fit over my leg were Ranger panties. So he walks in and immediately looks at it, and he just goes, "Oh, fuck."
Really? That's always a good sign. Thanks, Doc. Fucking inspire confidence.
So he says, we're going to admit you into the hospital. He said, that's definitely infected, and we need to get you on IV antibiotics right now. He asked me, when did this first start? And I said, Sunday was when I noticed it. I went to the urgent care. I didn't even think to tell him that they injected steroids into it. I didn't think it mattered. I said, but they told me they thought it was bursitis. They sent me home and told me to follow up with you if it didn't get better from rest ice compression elevation, basically. And so I get to the hospital a couple hours later. They admit me into a room. They told me plan to be here for 1 to 2 weeks on IV antibiotics. And they reassured me that we're catching this pretty early, and so IV antibiotics should take care of it, but it's more than oral antibiotics can do.
Yeah.
So they said we'll start you on a regimen here. If things are going well, we'll put a PICC line in and send you home, and you can do your IV antibiotics from home probably for another 4 to 6 weeks, and then you'll be good to go. After 4 or 5 days in the hospital every day, so they would mark the outline of the redness, and then later that day they would come in, see if it's spread, and mark the new outline. By day 4 or 5, my whole leg looked like a topographical map.
Wow.
With just new circles, and at this point it was like from my hip to my ankle. So they said, we're going to do an exploratory incision tomorrow. We'll put you under for it, but we're just going to make a small, like 2-inch incision just to see what's right underneath the surface, what the flesh looks like, what kind of fluids in there. So they did that. I woke up from the surgery. They did that late at night, though, so I didn't get any immediate answers. I didn't know what they found. The next morning, the doc comes in. They didn't sew it shut. They just packed it, and so he pulls the packing out. And this is the first time I could actually see what was going on. And he said, hey, you have a flesh-eating bacteria that is eating you from the inside out.
Fucking alien jumped out of your leg.
Yeah.
Jesus.
So, and he told me, he said, when I made that incision, it looks like somebody opened the dishwasher mid-cycle and a bunch of dirty dishwasher fluid and spaghetti sauce spilled out of your leg.
Damn.
So he said, we stopped right there, but today we're going to do another procedure, and we're going to open up your entire leg, and we're going to scrub everything between the skin and the muscle mass in there. And we're going to scrape out all the dead flesh that is already eroded. We're going to sprinkle some antibiotic powder in there, and then we're not going to close it up. We're going to pack your whole leg with wound vacs.
And that's the whole thing, like from your hip to your ankle was wide open?
So from about mid-thigh to just below my knee, probably like in
a foot.
Yeah, maybe a little bit more.
Yeah.
Was one incision, and then there were incisions on the sides of my calves on both sides, and then from my ankle on both sides. So this big one, he would reach his arm all the way up to his elbow and scrub out from my hip down. And then those little ones, they used like surgical toothbrushes and stuck those in there and scrubbed everything real good.
Dude, the post-op fucking trauma and pain from that had to be god-awful.
So that's an interesting story. I woke up after maybe the second procedure, and my body went into shock from the pain. And so after that, because they had to do this every 3 or 4 days for months. And so after that second one, the second one that I think is the first time in my life, in my adult life, where I cried from physical pain.
Yeah.
Like just broke down.
I mean, I can see that kind of duration, like that testing your will to even want to fucking stay alive.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
You just be like, dude, this isn't worth it. Fuck it.
Yeah. So, but after that second one, so I woke up and I just started crying. And I was like, at this point, like I swallowed my pride and they're like, is everything okay? I was like, it just fucking hurts real bad.
Yeah, and it's not like they can keep you hopped up on fentanyl that whole time.
Right.
I mean, because like
they would give me fentanyl pre and post surgery. And then throughout the night and the days that I didn't have surgery, I was getting morphine, Dilaudid, Percocet. So I was on like the whole gamut.
Yeah.
And then
like,
surgery days, I'd get fentanyl.
Yeah.
Well, what they started doing, because they wanted to keep my body from going into shock from that pain, is as soon as I would start to come back from the anesthesia, they would immediately hit me with ketamine and I would go back into this dream state for like 30 minutes. And then you kind of fade back into reality from that. And so it's not this immediate shock to your system. And during that time, they can adjust the pain meds. If they need to give me more fentanyl and they need to give me more Dilaudid, they can do that. And then the pain's under control and I don't go into shock.
Wow. The entire process from the very first surgery until the last was 10 months?
So as far as cleaning out the actual infection, that was about 8 months.
So for 8 months, you were on high doses of opioids.
Yes.
So, I mean, how was that coming down off of that? Like
A nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, that's like heroin withdrawal
Absolutely.
type shit, right?
Absolutely. And to talk about your previous point, I had lost that will to fight. So there was a period of time where I was not taking all of my opiates and saving them and taking them at once so that I would hopefully not wake up the next day.
Cheeking the medication?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Holy fuck. Was there ever a point where you considered or asked or explored the possibility of just amputating to not?
I asked multiple times.
Yeah.
So 8 months to get the infection cleared out. But then after that, there was still another 1.5 years of reparative surgeries of the leg. It had eventually spread into my blood and got into my heart and into my bones. And so it just started chewing tendons off the bones. So like my bicep now is no longer a bicep. It's some dead person's calf and Achilles tendon.
No shit.
That they grafted in there. So there were a lot of reparative surgeries, which afterwards were back on opiates for a period of time. But by that point, with the reparative surgeries, I had kind of learned my lesson. And so I took them when I needed to, but then I got off of them as soon as I felt like I could. That after that initial 8 months, though, there was definitely an addiction.
Yeah. Did you know it?
Yeah, because I would start to try to come off of it and then I'd have a bad day where pain was worse and I would go right back up to the highest dose that I was prescribed.
What were you taking?
Dilaudid, Percocet, and time-release morphine.
So they would prescribe a bunch of that to you and you could just take it however you wanted?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Man.
And, and then they would even, a month, 2 months, 3 months after surgery, because of everything, you go to a doctor and they look over these medical records and they're like, holy fuck. And so then they just would be like, whatever you need, man, just tell me. And so like I realized I was asking for more narcotics when I really didn't need narcotics. And what I needed was someone to tell me, hey, you don't need narcotics. But because this was something that they're not used to seeing, they're like, we're not going to argue with this dude. We're going to just give him what he needs. And so that was when I realized, like, hey, I'm not taking these anymore for the pain. I'm taking these because of the dependency that my body has on them.
Wow.